Every time I dive into the lore of Deltarune, there is one specific character that just wants to leave my mind. Kris, an unfortunate soul who was forced to stand between two opposite sides, playing a role for each. And what exactly I mean by that, I'll explain today, because honestly this theory hasn't left my head ever since I finished chapter 4 and I really want to talk about it. So get ready, because today once again we are diving into the world of Deltarune. But before we move on to our discussion, this video will contain a lot of spoilers for the story of Deltarune, so if you don't want to get spoiled, why are you still here? Okay, in this video I'll try to piece together everything that happened, what Kris did to cause all this, how the prophecy might be at the heart of it all, and how Susie could be the key to helping Kris make things right. And to understand what I mean by that, we need to start at the very beginning. I mean, even before all the events of the game. The Dreamer and Holiday families used to be good friends, often spending time together until at some point this harmony was broken by a certain incident. The families stopped interacting, Toriel and Asgore divorced. Asgore himself was fired from his position as a police officer. In short, things turned into a mess, but because of that, the question arises, what kind of incident could have led to where we are now? Well, to me, the egg room in chapter 4 strongly hints at what happened. In it, we enter a completely darkened art club, the kind where we draw pictures and don't kill each other. In this room, Kris kept sketching the same picture over and over. Through many repetitions, their movement became faster and smoother, but because Kris kept layering the sketches on top of each other, the surface of the canvas was nothing more than a monochrome smear. In the end, Kris simply painted a tree over everything, leaving behind nothing but a simple, still life. After this, Kris decided to wash their hands, but between their fingers a faint grey crease glittered stubbornly, and Kris can never wash it all away, as if it was some kind of guilt they could never forget. And, if we recall that incident I talked about earlier, I think I understand what all of this means. In short, the incident I mentioned above, it was Dess's disappearance. If you are in a fandom 24/7, you probably know about this one, but the reason for her disappearance is still unknown. And although I can't say for sure if Asgore himself was involved in this, because there are also many hints pointing towards him, maybe that bump really was shaped like a deer, but still, judging from what we learned in the egg room, I believe Kris were the main cause of Dess's disappearance. Because otherwise, I don't know what else you could connect that whole scene to. And as for what exactly happened between Kris and Dess, well, considering Kris likes to pull pranks, let's say maybe one day they just wanted to prank someone as usual. Dess happened to be the one who got caught in it, and as they say, the prank got out of control and something very bad happened to Dess. Because of this, Kris feels horrible, relieves it again and again, thinking how it could have gone differently, but that grey crease that never washes off keeps constantly reminding them of it. Kris messed up big time, but luckily not everything was lost yet. Here's what I think happened. Either Kris themselves told Carol about the situation, or she found out on her own, it doesn't really change the point. But what is clear, they began working together in an attempt to save Dess. How do they even save her? A good question, because we don't really have concrete answers, but still I have a little theory about this. We can speculate for a long time about what exactly happened to Dess. Maybe she somehow ended up in a special dark world, the kind you can't escape by simply closing the fountain, because it could be something like a literal darkness, I don't know. Or maybe if the roaring night we meet in chapter 3 and 4 actually is Dess, which is also very possible, then maybe the incident Kris caused somehow transformed her into the night, or perhaps she was even forced to become one just to save her own life, and right now she's on the verge of death. Because looking at the night in the game, well, it definitely doesn't look like anything healthy. And here's the thing, whether she might be trapped in that special dark world or whether she could be the night, either way, both of these things are to some extent tied to the prophecy, because just as the Dark Worlds are a key part of it, so is the Night, the one who creates them. And considering that everyone in the world of Deltarune knows about the prophecy, what if, because of all these factors, Carol and Kris decided that maybe the only thing that could help them save Des is to follow the prophecy? Or at least they believed it could help, even though the prophecy clearly warns about the danger they could unleash upon this world. But for Kris the main thing is to bring back their friend, and for Carol her daughter. So despite all the risks, they choose to go through with it, because for them it seemed like the only solution. And since Kris is the reason why Des ended up in such state, by promising to help fulfill the prophecy, they become the first hero of the legend, letting us, the soul, into this world. I'm sure this decision wasn't an easy one, because by doing so, they literally handed over full control of themselves to an unknown being, without which they now can't even properly function, but still, the guilt weighs on their shoulders, and they promise to make things right. But it seems like that promise won't be fulfilled, because into the story bursts Susie, the destroyer of the prophecy and the savior of the world. What do I mean by that? Well, look, if Carol and Kris's plan was to follow the prophecy, then from the very start Susie was never supposed to be the second hero. I think many of you have already heard about this theory, but let me quickly run through it, because it's going to be very important for us. So, considering Susie wasn't supposed to be the second hero, it means that from the start we were already going off track from the prophecy, and in fact chapter 4 gives us a lot of hints about this. Look, the main heroes of the legend were supposed to be the first hero, the cage with human soul and parts, the second hero, the girl with hope crossed on her heart, and the third hero, the prince, alone in deepest dark. And if with the first and third heroes everything is clear, Kris and Ralsei, then with the second question appears. Like, if we are already traveling with Susie, then logically it should be her, right? But then why does another part of the prophecy say, and last was the girl with the symbol of Earthbuster, the symbol that is associated with Susie, and saying the last was about the second of the three heroes doesn't really sound right either. Something isn't lining up. So, going back to the second hero, if it's not Susie, then who should it be? If you look at how this part of the prophecy appears, you can see that the silhouette shown there doesn't quite look like Susie, since she doesn't wear a cape and doesn't carry swords. But who does wear a cape and can hold a sword? Exactly, Noelle. And she was supposed to be the second hero of the prophecy, but her place was taken by Susie. Okay, so this part we've discussed, but now the question arises. If Kris, Carol and the Knight's plan was to follow the prophecy exactly as it was with no changes, then what now? It turns out the plan hadn't even started yet, but it was already going off track. Well, yeah, that's bad, but maybe heroes don't have to be exactly the same as they are in the prophecy. Besides, Susie was still, in one way or another, part of this prophecy, so maybe nothing major will change if you swap a couple of people around. And honestly, thanks to Ralsei, we still seem to be following the prophecy pretty well, but with Susie, things aren't that simple. The fact remains, with her interference, she has already changed the prophecy, and Carol understands this herself, which is why she snaps at her the very moment she sees her. But in reality, the fact that Susie replaced the second hero and that Susie changed the prophecy at all is exactly what is going to help fix everything. Because to me, it feels like the original prophecy would only make things worse. Alright, so let's think together. How would the game have unfolded if everything had gone exactly according to the prophecy? And honestly, this will be quite difficult. We still don't know the full version of the prophecy, and while chapter 4 gave us a lot to think about, I still wouldn't say it was enough. Either way, I suggest we work with what we already have, and for that, a great character like Gerson, along with the story he told us, Lord of the Hammer, which is based upon the prophecy, can really help us. If we take this story as at least some kind of foundation, then the original storyline probably might have gone something like this. The first chapter most likely wouldn't be much different. Kris, Noelle and Susie fall into the dark world and meet Ralsei. He tells us about a part of the prophecy. Susie runs away from us and teams up with Lancer, while we with Noelle and Ralsei as three original heroes group up and move forward. That's how we progress through the story of the first chapter almost without changes. The only difference is Susie's role will be more like Birdley's in chapter 2. For the major part of the chapter she plays a role of a bad guy, but in the end we stop her, maybe even somewhat befriend her, and the chapter ends with us closing the fountain. After Kris, Noelle and Susie return to the light world. Kris and Noelle will probably convince Susie that it was all just a dream, while they themselves will continue following the prophecy and closing fountains. In the next chapter the story will begin to differ. In the second chapter the heroes do battle in chariots to save the queen apparently. In the third chapter the heroes travel among the islands and catch a glimpse of a lost land. Which, by the way, we sorta still can do in the actual game, but more on that later. And so on and so forth, until we reach the story's end. The outcome nobody would want. The final tragedy unveils, and it seems like to save the world, someone would have to sacrifice their life. That's exactly why I think following the prophecy is a bad idea, but luckily I believe it won't come to that. Let's just say the main puzzle of the prophecy, the one that could lead everything to tragedy, is missing, because Susie took that place. I'll tell you what, if Noelle had remained the second hero, I think everything could have ended even worse than we think. Don't forget, the weird route exists, and as I understand, no matter whether we follow the original prophecy or not, if the player would want it, they could still start it. So the fact that from the very beginning Susie took Noelle's role changes a lot for the better. In general, while Kris and Carol thought the prophecy was unchangeable, Susie's appearance as the second hero proved that it is not like that at all. And by the very fact of her showing up, I'm almost sure that it also affected how Kris and Ralsei see the world, so to speak. We can see this most clearly on Ralsei, because at least he can talk. Like, I think everyone remembers how in the first two chapters Ralsei kept talking only about the prophecy and how important it was, while about himself he directly told us that we shouldn't worry about his feelings or about the feelings of darkness in general. But Susie's behavior, the way she supported him, clearly started to affect him. And even Ralsei himself realizes this, because in chapter 4 he directly tells us about it. Like how in general he never had any interests or hobbies, but lately he feels how his own thoughts, likes and dislikes are developing. And even though earlier he always said the prophecy couldn't be changed because of Susie, he himself started to believe that maybe it can be changed. And like I said, I am convinced that in his character development, Susie played the main role, because first of all she gave him this example that instead of blindly following the rules, you can choose your own path and nothing terrible will happen because of it. And that is why I believe this also affected Kris, since they too, slowly but surely, began to take more control over themselves. Like, I think you remember how in the first chapters Kris didn't really take control over themselves at all. But the farther we moved through the story and the chapters, the more Kris started acting the way they wanted. What stood out to me the most was Kris playing the piano on their own. It's something they truly enjoy, but even though in the light world we could walk up to the piano again and again, they never did play it before on their own. And I think earlier they didn't do this because maybe Carol herself convinced them that they should not interfere with the player's actions, since if you think about it, all three of the heroes should have acted only the way the player wanted. Kris you know we are the one controlling them. Ralsei, despite the fact that he himself opposed fighting darkness and scolded Susie for it, when we do it, he literally doesn't say anything to us. And well, even though on a weird route we forced her to do things she didn't like, she still did them anyway. But then Susie shows up and she doesn't care what we say. And with her example she shows others that they too have the right to choose. And it also seems to me that her appearance even changed how Kris sees the idea of following the prophecy word for word. Why exactly they changed their mind can be speculated about for a long time, but I would say that maybe Kris didn't like this plan from the very beginning, even if we don't see this in the game itself. I mean, just think about it. It's already enough that Kris gave up control over themselves to some unknown being, and on top of that, the prophecy itself sounds doubtful with all these tragedies tied to it. Anyway, a couple of moments from the game make it seem like Kris changed their mind about following the prophecy after all, and are slowly, quietly trying to prevent it from fulfilling. Or at least I think like that. Look, the beginning of chapter 4 clearly showed us that Kris and Carol absolutely do not want Susie to find out about their conspiracy, and they also don't let us interfere with their plan. Kris rips out the soul the very second we almost learn code from the shelter, and when Susie finally gets the guitar, Carol immediately takes it away. In short, they really don't want any outsiders to know about their conspiracy, but then the question comes up. Why does Kris, both in chapter 1 and chapter 2, tells Undyne about the Dark Worlds? And what's most interesting, only Undyne. And well, I think I know the reason. If we stick to the theory that Kris is trying to prevent the prophecy from fulfilling, then obviously they cannot do this directly, neither in the light world, because then Carol will find out, nor in the dark world, because then the knight who is also working with them would find out. But it doesn't necessarily have to be Kris who stops the prophecy, if you know what I mean. Undyne, well, clearly has absolutely no idea about what Carol and Kris are plotting, but what makes her special is that she has access to the shelter, the main place where most likely all the major stuff is happening. And what if, just like by accident, not even on purpose, Undyne learns about the Dark Worlds, and after she finds out, we could somehow team up with her and think of something against the prophecy being fulfilled completely. Because honestly, I really can't explain in any other way why at the end of the second chapter Kris slashed the tires to lure Undyne to the Dark Worlds, just so she could finally see it with her own eyes, because she didn't want to believe only words. But also it looks like things turned out a little differently than Kris expected, because as soon as the knight saw Undyne, they immediately switched from Toriel and rushed to take Undyne to the shelter. And remembering that later in the conversation with Carol we hear something about Undyne being sacrificed next week, well, it looks like things didn't go quite as planned. Honestly, this whole moment with Undyne is a bit confusing. Like, sure, maybe this whole thing with Undyne and luring her into the Dark World actually was planned from the very beginning and she was needed to Kris and Carol for something. I am not arguing with that. That could also be the case, but still I see the picture more as Kris wanting to somehow influence the plan with Undyne's help, but unfortunately this attempt failed. I just really don't understand then why Kris went through all of this just to make Undyne, I don't know, believe that the Dark Worlds exists, and also why the knight at first was going to take Toriel, but the moment they saw Undyne, they switched to her. As a last resort, all of this could have been planned by Kris on purpose to save Toriel. After all, she's their mother, and who knows what the knight and Carol were planning to do with her, and so maybe that's why they learned Undyne, so instead of Toriel, Undyne will be taken. Anything is possible. Okay, going back to the main topic of the conversation, I kind of see that Kris, well, at the very least, no longer really wants to follow the prophecy. They know what this could lead to, they do care about Susie and Ralsei, and because the prophecy suggests that one of them might potentially have to sacrifice their life, Kris don't want this to happen because they grew attached to them. And we especially see this in chapter 4. They don't let us be rude to Ralsei when he asks if it's okay for a Darkner to feel the way he feels, and with Susie there was a very telling moment at the beginning and the end of this chapter. For some reason, seeing Susie next to you, you felt like whatever you were, just for now, it might be okay. Thanks to her, Kris now sees the world differently. Thanks to her, maybe regardless of what the prophecy says, it might not actually happen. From the very beginning, the plan was that Kris, as the leader of the group, together with Noelle and Ralsei, will just blindly follow the prophecy. As Gerson said when he told us about the Lord of the Hammer, only 6 chapters were written. What happened next? Who knows? The ones who could write the next, they used. The pen was lying there for them to pick up. To make the next page, they never did. And at least for me, it's as if he's talking about Kris, who could have written a new story, a new prophecy, but decided not to, even despite its bad ending. Then, addressing Susie, Gerson told her that he sees a story shining in her eyes, and almost like a final blow, he says that the pen, the one that can write a new story and finish it properly, is being held by Susie. And it seems even Kris understands this, and that's why they feel that being next to her, everything will be fine. That maybe, with her help, everything can be fixed, because on their own, they cannot do it. Damn, honestly, I feel incredibly sorry for Kris. They once mistakenly did a terrible thing connected with death, and this still haunts them to this day. They promised Carol they will do anything in their power to save Death, so they gave us, the player, control over themselves and followed the prophecy. And now, when they finally realize that following the prophecy is a bad idea, Kris is literally stuck between two sides. They cannot refuse to help Carol because it's their fault Death disappeared, but at the same time, if they tell Susie that all this time they didn't let her know the code, that all this time they knew about the prophecy, and worst of all, that the Kris Susie thought she knew all along isn't even the real Kris, can you imagine how she'll react? Like, okay, let's not forget this is still just a theory, not the fact that everything is exactly how I'm saying it, but still, what we can say for sure is that Kris does care about Susie, but despite this, they are still acting behind her back, and considering how much Susie hates it when people hide things from her, oh, I'm expecting this will lead to some not very good consequences. Still, I believe that within their abilities, Kris will manage to do everything right. If their plan really is to move as far away from the prophecy as possible whenever they can and not let Carol realize it, then this means that Noelle absolutely must not return to the Dark Worlds or to this prophecy at all. Susie has already done her part by replacing Noelle, and Kris continues her work, suppressing any attempt to bring Noelle back into the prophecy, and many factors point to this, especially those connected to the weird route. Look, if we stick to the theory that Lord of the Hammer is how our original story was supposed to go, then in chapter 3 we should have been traveling among the islands and catching a glimpse of a lost land. And well, if we don't go off the main path in this chapter, then we won't reach such a land. But if we get an S rank in all of Tana's games, so we'll have the opportunity to enter a secret room, where we can play the original version of the game Legends of Tana, in which we travel between islands and arrive to some lost land. So here's what I'm getting at. In this secret original game, we can also get such an interesting phrase from Tana.
I did what you said, Kris. Just like our deal. You aren't gonna turn me off again, are you?
And after this dialogue, Kris stabs Tana with a knife as if they are turning him off because Tana failed. to fulfill the deal. So, a logical question arises. What was this deal between Kris and Tenna? Even though we don't have direct hints about this in the game, I still think I know what it could be tied to. My theory is that Kris had to not let us play the original game because it not only gives us the Shadow Mantle, which helps a lot in the fight with the Knight, but also shows us how to start the weird route. Something Kris really wouldn't want. And that's why Kris and Tenna made a deal, according to which Tenna had to remake the original game and remove all the hints about the weird route, because otherwise the player will then find out how to do it, and if the player does it, then potentially they could bring Noelle back into the team, and then... well, I think you get it. Then we will return to the original prophecy, and all of Kris's attempts to change something will be meaningless. To me, this theory sounds pretty logical, in the sense that since Kris needs Noelle not to return to the team, they would intentionally not show us how to do it, and the only thing that could still reveal it, Kris hides. As I said, by making a deal with Tenna, in which he remakes the original game into Legends of Tenna, and in return Kris promises not to turn him off, which for Tenna is the most important thing. But when the player does fully learn about this route, then the deal they made falls apart. Kris symbolically stabs him with a knife, as if turning him off, and also in the battle with Tenna, Kris will deal the most damage to him, more than even Susie, as if they are intentionally hitting him harder out of anger. And interestingly, if you didn't get the Shadow Mantle during this chapter, meaning you didn't play the original game, then Kris will deal their usual damage. To me, this theory sounds interesting, but still there are things to be taken issue with. For example, how did Kris even find out that in the original games he's shown how to make the weird route? Like, yeah, Kris knows about the prophecy, and maybe this detail could be mentioned there, but I'm not sure Kris knows the prophecy as good as Ralsei does, or if the weird route isn't mentioned in the prophecy at all. There's also the problem that maybe the deal between Tenna and Kris isn't connected to the weird route at all, but to the Shadow Mantle, which we get after fully completing the original games. And the Shadow Mantle, let me remind you, is something that protects the wearer from attacks of the Knight, with whom Kris also cooperates. Like, everything is possible. This can be discussed for a long time, because just like my theory with the weird route can be tied to all of this, so can be theory about the Shadow Mantle. But going back to Noelle and the weird route, even if we manage to start this route, Kris will still try to protect Noelle from us and prevent her from returning to the prophecy. What Kris does at the end of chapter 2 also shows to us this. Even though we don't see it ourselves, Noelle tells us about it. She told us that for a long time after returning from the Dark World, she couldn't fall asleep. At some point she went out on the porch to breathe, and then she felt Kris's hand on her shoulder. They told her it was all just a stupid prank and apologized for their behavior. Then they pulled a thorn from Noelle's finger and asked her not to bring it up the next time she saw them, because we would hear it. Kris doesn't only want to protect Noelle from us, because let's be honest, we treat Noelle horribly on the weird route, but Kris also understands that if we manage to gain more control over Noelle, things will get much worse. And that's why on the weird route, when we are given the choice to proceed or stop, Kris begs us to stop. Kris doesn't want to let this happen, but if we still choose to proceed and put the thorn ring back on Noelle, letting her know that this was not a dream but reality, from that moment on it seems like there's no way back. And that's why Kris in that very moment snaps at us, because we made things so horrible that not only are we hurting Noelle, we are also dooming the world to danger. And understanding that from a gameplay perspective this will all lead to a bad ending, I feel like what will happen won't just be the tragedy mentioned in the prophecy, but something even worse than that. Well, that's where all my mini theories come to an end, so I suggest we put together everything I've said here. The Dreamer and Holiday families live in harmony, but this harmony is broken by Des's disappearance, which unfortunately was caused by Kris. It was an accident. Kris feels terrible about it, so they agreed to make a deal with Carol to fix it. And the only path they see that can help with this is to follow the prophecy and let Kris be the vessel through which the player enters this world. But this plan sounds dangerous from the very beginning, since the prophecy can bring danger to this world. And worst of all, it seems like the prophecy cannot be changed, but still Kris has no other choice. Luckily, the prophecy changes right at the beginning thanks to Susie, because she replaces the second hero. And instead of getting angry at Susie for this, Kris begins to see hope that the tragedy, the sacrifice, or whatever is mentioned in the prophecy might not actually happen. As the story goes on, Kris grows closer to Susie, to Ralsei, stops any attempts to return Noel to the prophecy, and tries in every possible way to prevent the prophecy from fulfilling, or at least change it a little. Because from the very beginning, Kris thought the prophecy was unchangeable, so even though they seemed to be that main hero who could write a new story, they didn't do it. But luckily, now they see that it is possible. If not with their own hands, then at least through Susie's. Still, unfortunately, this puts Kris in a very tough situation. They are indebted to Carol, Des's mother, and cannot just stop following the prophecy, but at the same time they also cannot tell Susie about it, because then she will realize that Kris wasn't really the person she thought she knew. And yet, despite all this, Kris still has hope that everything will be done right, that things can return to the way they once were, happy and joyful. And what's most comforting, they are not alone in this. Maybe Susie doesn't know the whole picture, but she shares the same goal as Kris, to make everything better. And that's why Kris has the feeling that with her help, finally, everything will turn back to the things they were before. But hey, at the end of the day, this is just a theory. It may come true or it may not, but this is how I see it. As you probably noticed, to build this theory I had to combine a lot of other theories, so I hope all of this didn't end up as a mess in your head. I understand that this theory isn't perfect. Of course, if you want to pick it apart, I think you'll definitely find something to argue with. Still, to me this theory has a chance to exist, and honestly, I believe in it myself, because many moments from the game can actually be tied to it. And besides, I'm not claiming this theory to be 100% right. To be fair, remembering how other past theories got instantly destroyed as soon as chapter 3 and 4 came out, I'm not betting on being completely right this time either. But one way or another, it was really fun and interesting for me to build this theory, and that's the most important thing in my opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, what you agree with, what you don't, and what you could add yourself. If you'd like to see more theories like this, lore breakdowns and so on, I can recommend one of my earlier videos about Locker. And starting from now on, there will be more of this kind of content coming to the channel, so make sure to subscribe. And lastly, thank you for watching.